As you know, the network neutrality issue has been at the forefront of both the press and the legislative sort of folks for the last few months, but to a slightly lesser degree for about the last year and a half. There are now both House and Senate bills, which we will do our best to acquaint you with, and we'll have a little bit of discussion back and forth here. Why don't I get started by introducing folks? Probably most of the people here are known to most of you. Brokaw Price runs Peering for Yahoo. Sean Doran is a free agent at this point, but back in the day was the guy who taught us all that it was pronounced rooting rather than routing for Sprint. Sean Donelan has run operations, network operations in quite a few places, but is now at Cisco. And Jean Liu is working for Neustar now and has in the past been cable. See how I do with slides. Bill just asked which one is Vint Cerf, and I think Sean here can best channel it. Yes, the other Sean. August 2005, there was an FCC policy statement which basically reiterated what Powell had said before, but with a whole lot of kind of law enforcement CALIA stuff mixed in, making it about 3 times as long. So now it's access lawful internet content, run applications and services subject to the needs of law enforcement, connect legal devices that do no harm to the network, and competition among network service providers, application and service. And they threw in one more. All of these principles are subject to reasonable network management, which is the big caveat at the end that gives the telco guys the out, and so that they can say, oh, well, we don't actually need to do network neutrality per se because we need to manage our network and they're in conflict. QoS is a fundamental need, blah, blah, blah. So that kind of got the argument moving again. Now we're into 2006. In March, there was the Internet Non-Discrimination Act, which was sort of based on a finding that only 2% of Americans have market choice of broadband providers, and that was an effective monopoly or oligopoly, and that therefore regulation was needed. So that was a Senate bill, and that got referred into the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee and is still sitting there, 3 months later. The basic points of that were that ISPs shall not interfere with, block, degrade, alter, modify, impair, or change bits or content. They shall not discriminate in allocating bandwidth and transmitting content. And they shall not assess a charge to any application or service provider not on their network. It goes on to say, though, that they may take measures to protect customers from attacks and malware if customers are given prior notice of what they're doing and given ISPs shall prevent any activity that is unlawful. That's right, you're drafted. And shall give priority to emergency communications, despite the fact that you're not allowed to look in the packets and treat things differently. Then, May 2006, just a few weeks ago, you get the House equivalent bill, the Internet Freedom and Non-Discrimination Act, which takes a slightly different tack. It modifies the Clayton Antitrust Act, so this sort of puts things forward in an antitrust light and tries to position it such that the Justice Department gets more control rather than commerce. And that passed Judiciary Committee very quickly, and like almost everything in this, it's been on party lines. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who will give a little bit more detail about, and his thoughts about all of the legislative stuff.
Hello, Sean Donelan. As I say on my slide, I don't represent any current, past, or future employer. So don't blame them for what I'm about to say. For all the router geeks out here, no, this does not work in your router. Sorry. Still doesn't work. So Bill started out with recent history, but network neutrality has had multiple names over the years. And the current incarnation has kind of turned into this huge good versus evil. We need to save the internet and the world from everything. 2003, same person, Representative Connors, was also talking about network neutrality. This was back in a few mergers ago, depending on which merger we're talking about. At that time, they were also talking about cable neutrality, but rather than the telephone companies at that time, it was the cable companies. And if you go back even further in history, we've had various battles about all sorts of things. And what's interesting is a lot of times the government has stepped in through various agencies. And when they step in, they sometimes make interesting choices. For the old graybeards around here, remember the ANS days with Core plus RE. And that was fully approved, fully backed by the National Science Foundation as a great idea to bring commercialization and privatization to the network. But we also had the battles with KICS. At that time, KICS was the good guys and ANS was the evil guys. But then KICS turned into the evil guy because they were going to start filtering resellers. And at that time, Sprint was the good guy, I believe, because Sprint was opposing KICS. But don't worry, Sprint then turned into the evil guy, and we keep on going. So the National Science Foundation had this great thing called the NREN NAP solicitation, Network Access Point, and it included clauses in there like all network service providers had to connect to all the primary network access points, priority network access points. But it also had other clauses like you also had to support gossip and OSI and all those other good things. In reality, all that did is just create a whole lot of opportunities for a lot of service providers out there because no one could be sure what was going on with the network, so you better get a couple of network service providers. Multi-homing became real big because you never knew when a peering battle might break out between someone. We had peering battles back then. I left it off, but there was the great pizzahut.com debate. If folks remember, it turns out you cannot reach pizzahut.com if you were on a university network because it violated the acceptable use policy at the time. But you could reach it from UUNet. So here's the policy wonk slide. In the United States, of which North America is part of, or the United States is part of North America, although our Canadians sometimes like to point out they're not actually a state. We don't hold it against them. In Chicago, we have the Communications Act of 1934, and it tried to divide up things based upon technology in 1934. So you kind of had common carriers, broadcast, radio at the time, and TV came later. And then you had the general FCC authority, which is kind of like this catch-all. If we can't figure out what it is, the FCC still has authority over it. So at the beginning, there wasn't much. There was some stuff in the catch-all, but pretty much everything was either common carrier or radio. But then you got weird stuff like cable TV came in, and time sharing and remote data processing. And those all were also under the general authority. 1984, they carved out cable TV and put it off into its own little silo over there. So now you had this weird thing where you had common carrier, but cable TV was not a common carrier. But then what happens when cable starts doing voice and cable data and things like that? Is that under Title VI or Title II, or things got really weird? So recently the FCC moved DSL and cable modems out of Title II and Title VI back into Title I as kind of the general catch-all category. And then I have up there VoIP, and I could put IPTV and whatever random things we come up in the future. Which silo do all those things go into if you're trying to do regulation? The reason why that's important because that kind of sets the framework for how the government deals with technology. The other big thing was the Telecom Act of 1996. Before 1996, we had something called enhanced services. If you remember, these were things like TimeNet, Telnet, CompuServe, remote time sharing, and so forth. And the theory behind enhanced services was there was only a single supplier of transmission capacity in any part of the country. Usually that was AT&T, sometimes it was GTE, few thousand other little small telephone companies you'd never heard of. And the concern was that you had this one company entering into what was viewed as a competitive marketplace. In reality, this was more or less the IBM versus AT&T battle of the 1950s. After 1996, information services were defined in the Telecom Act. But the interesting thing about information services is they run over telecommunications, not a common carrier. And anyone can provide telecommunications. Your Wi-Fi is telecommunications. If you run fiber yourselves, that's telecommunications. And you don't need to be a common carrier in order to do telecommunications. And that's why cable companies can now offer telecommunications even though they're not considered common carriers. And likewise, radio and television stations can also broadcast IP packets in their subcarriers as telecommunications without becoming common carriers. So now we have this interesting thing of we have multiple suppliers of information services, and they aren't really, you can't replace one with the other. They aren't all the same. Yahoo and Google are distinct information services, and just because you have one doesn't mean you don't want the other. And you also have some suppliers of network access, but not as many, generally 2 or so. But now you have the potential for new entrants from any direction in both those areas. And in fact, in 2006, the majority of home broadband access does not come over common carriers as defined by the 1934 Act. They actually come over cable companies. Basically, just having multiple resellers of the same product wasn't good enough to attract customers. Customers are basically fickle. So regardless of whether you think network neutrality is good, evil, what you think people are going to do, most network providers have found, as we saw going all the way back to the ANS days or the CompuServe days or the AOL days, that interfering with what the customers want to do is a bad business practice, because you can't predict what the next killer app is going to be. And the nice thing about the internet is everyone can complain about everything. Who would have heard about Madison River a few years ago? The Associated Press might have written a little article, but now everyone knows the name. So the reality is access providers need as many information services as possible, and information services need as many access providers as possible. But the hard thing about putting this into kind of a cute phrase like network neutrality is we really have no idea what those deals are going to be in advance. I mean, if we had set the network rules based on 1992, we would have had ANS Core RE as the defined official government grant of networking in the U.S. But instead, we refrained from that, and we watched the peering battles go through and all kinds of other really bad stuff happen, and we worked our way through it. And the hard thing about working our way through it is we really don't know what customers will think is going to be a network improvement versus network interference. Even between customers, even between service providers and information services, there's not a real clear idea of what they think next year would be a network improvement, even though last year they considered that a network interference. We've seen that with a lot of the spam and antivirus and the DDoS and all the other things that solely customers have had asked are now viewed as network improvements, whereas 5 years ago they might have been viewed as network interference. And finally, if you start writing regulations, it implies investigative and enforcement capacity or capability. And if you look at anything that the government does, basically you have one line, one sentence in a statute, and that usually turns into a couple of hundred pages in the Code of Federal Regulations and several hundred court cases. And the reality is government agencies, whichever one you want, state, federal, local, are all overworked, underfunded. So who's going to try and enforce these regulations? If you say anyone can enforce them, then basically everyone, including competitors, will just start filing complaints about any perceived thing, or just simply on the principle of if you file a complaint, then your competitor can't do something, and you get another few years to do whatever you're doing. So we've seen this with the Telecom Acts and the Communications Act. Basically, the court dockets and the agency dockets are filled with complaints, counter complaints, and vice versa, going back and forth. And for regulators, technology is just too hard. I mean, when you come down to it, if you look at how they solve problems generally, they end up just saying, okay, we can't figure out what you're going to do or how you're doing it, but we do understand dollars. So we're just going to say, okay, you can go ahead and do it, but you only can charge $5 to do it, or you can only charge $10 to do it, or whatever. So in the end, the regulation never actually prevents any company from doing whatever it is. The government just steps in and sets the price. So if you're trying to prevent evil, the government will say, well, you can be evil, it'll just cost you a few dollars. And we've seen this before, the broadcast fairness doctrine. In the U.S., this is the equal time provision. In the end, the networks the national networks have just decided they won't sell anyone. This is very equal. No one gets to buy advocacy ads on national networks, except politicians, who get the lowest ad rates. Again, government can set dollars, but they can't figure out much else. And the Kingsbury Commitment, this is the thing, the Kingsbury Commitment is actually what created the AT&T monopoly. It sounded great. AT&T will interconnect with all the telephone companies in the U.S. But in the end, what it really did is it eliminated any need to have any competitive long distance, because AT&T had to connect with everyone, so why do you need a second long distance company? And that let AT&T set rates for 60 years. And finally, we've seen the same thing with universal service, that it sounds great, we're going to give telephones to everyone, but what it turned out to be is the regulators viewed the goal of giving telephones to everyone as protecting the people who were giving the telephones to everyone. So we'll go on to the next one.
So Sean's given us a bit of a historical background on the ongoing struggle between regulators and telco. I'm going to give you a very quick primer on the arguments in favor of net neutrality and the arguments against net neutrality. A few of the ones in favor, preference will go to dominant players rather than technological innovators if you allow ISPs and phone companies to block new technologies on their network, right? The people who are innovating don't have money yet to make payoffs to carriers. The people who are sitting on already developed technology do have that money. It locks things in place. As long as consumers can't vote with their feet in a free market of competing providers, they have to be protected from predatory practices, right? This is the argument that if you have a monopoly, people can't just pick up and leave and try something else, so you have to keep the monopoly from doing things anti-competitive, or keep them from doing things that would hurt the consumer, rather. Non-discrimination is part and parcel of common carrier status is another argument that if you want the benefits of common carrier, you have to turn around and let everything go by without looking at it. And lastly, a lot of the access networks were built under monopoly protection and had guaranteed rates being paid to them by consumers, and therefore they're kind of a moral property of the consumers rather than the people who were operating them at the time that they were getting guaranteed payments. So on the flip side, there are arguments against net neutrality. Discrimination is required to protect customers from bad traffic, and customers define some things as bad and will pay more to not receive that traffic than they would if they had to receive it, right? Spam, for instance. Service bundling is necessary to encourage future investment in infrastructure. If you want somebody to build out more infrastructure in the future, you have to let them make deals and make money with what they've got right now. Government doesn't understand the business of the internet, and any regulatory action will have unintended consequences, which will be worse than whatever was intended, because government doesn't know this stuff and will screw up if it tries to meddle. Lastly, non-discrimination is compelled speech in the First Amendment sense. You can't force someone to pay for someone else to say something that they disagree with. First Amendment protection. So let's get on to questions for the panel. I've got a few to get us started, and then if we have time and you guys choose to ask questions rather than going to lunch, we can continue as long as you feel like. First, let's start with the free speech issues. can carriers claim common carrier protection from responsibility for customer content, but also simultaneously claim a seemingly contradictory First Amendment protection from compelled speech? So, that's a question to you panelists. Do you want me to clarify it? Read it again? The guys up here obviously can't see any of this stuff again. Okay. Sean, victim.
Which one?
You.
Oh, me.
Of course.
All right. I actually gave you some snarky email about this a little while ago. Hi, I'm a Canadian, not an American. I'm putting the NA into nanog. I don't have a First Amendment like you have. Secondly, I have been living since 1997 at the start of the deregulatory process in Europe, where I've been working, among other things, with the European Commission on telecoms deregulation. And the approach that has been taken in Europe has been really different, even though fundamentally there are similar issues. Issues of basically the whole network neutrality debate, which I think summarize as, does the incumbent have the right to deliberately degrade services being offered to its customers in such a way that it targets non-customers as sales opportunities, i.e. connect to us and you'll get much better performance, or to terminate non-customers or competitors' use of their network to offer services which cannibalize their other value-added services like plain old telephone service in favor of voice over IP. And the question that arose in the deregulatory process in Europe was that given a process of unbundling of components like the local loop, access to carrier facilities, telehousing, housing in the head ends of various companies and so on and so forth, if people were given access to these components on an equal cost structure basis plus a percentage in profit to the incumbent, would the incumbent actually be able to sustain a deliberately degraded, i.e. biased, non-neutral service when other people were offering on the same local infrastructure a neutral service? That is, could market forces actually wipe out the possibility of exactly this kind of degraded service deliberately targeting the incumbent's competitors, new entrants into the market? And the risk was taken that rather than maintain the legacy of regulating a monopoly to take into account constitutional issues, social issues, employment issues, issues of fair access, and so on and so forth, the idea was that the regulators would create an artificial market and allow or encourage or enable new entrants to go in and compete directly with the incumbent on a more or less equal basis with similar components, which had by and large been paid for by taxpayers ultimately in the form of tax concessions to the private companies or in the form of the legacy companies having been PTT, postal telegraph, and telephony ministries, part of the government themselves. And so far it's worked. We've seen in terms of access to the internet, price decreases since 1997 on the order of between 100 and 100,000 full decreases in price per megabit per second per month. We're now seeing double-digit megabits per second DSL connectivity, even symmetrical DSL connectivity in almost all urban centers in Europe at double-digit US dollar per month prices. So for some $30 a month, you can get 10 or 15 megabits per second of actually useful DSL capacity in places like Paris. In some cities like Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö, Copenhagen, a couple of other places, and spreading, you can get triple-digit megabit per second connectivity, even symmetrical connectivity for double or even triple-digit US dollars per month. So somewhere between 90 and 150 US dollars a month can get you about 100 megabits a second in Stockholm, for example, depending on what part of town you live in. All of these services are offered by mutually competitive ISPs. Some of them are incumbents, some of them are competitors to the incumbent. Basically, they all use whatever local infrastructure is available, and the incumbent, by and large, is required to sell them off. The regulatory approach of unbundling and making sure that the market continues to allow new entrants, I think is the dominant question here. And the issue of, well, gee, we have a monopoly in place, let's regulate it and make sure it complies with free speech issues, whether or not constitutional issues apply. Make sure that it has prices which are in line of consumer price indices, make sure that the service offering is well defined, make sure that things like E911 is supported and so on and so forth, tends to interfere with the entry into the market of new competitors to the incumbent and tends basically to enhance the market power of the incumbent. And I think the major problem here is that the regulatory approach being discussed in Congress, which you guys have outlined, is exactly the wrong direction, and it's basically just going to make lots and lots of money for the incumbents who can afford lobbyists and people in their regulatory departments.
Well, Sean, your Europhile rant, which handily anticipates future discussion points
I wasn't
here,
meaning to be Europhile, because this has happened in other places other than the European
Oh,
Union.
absolutely.
I would love to see people in the United States, where I spend a lot of time, being able to get exactly the same DSL deals, which is, $50 a month gets you 50 megabits a second in an urban
My
center.
teasing you about being Europhile absolutely is in no way saying that it wouldn't be a much nicer place to deal with a regulatory environment. Anyway, has brought Bill up to the mic. Bill.
Actually, very much along the same lines as what Sean Doran was just speaking about. In the U.S., the question I have is, given the large amount of video traffic we're starting to see now on the net, do the cable companies have enough facilities to support the foreseeable future's worth of video traffic?
That also handily anticipates an upcoming question. But first, let me drop one on Brokaw. So let's just take a hypothetical situation. I'll pretend to be, say, a incumbent carrier in the southeast, and I'm going to say, well, so I've got this unfortunate net neutrality act that's blocking what I want to do, which is to just say, pay me some money even though you're not my customer, if you want to reach my customers. So instead, I'm going to say, well, since I can't be compelled to pay for speech that I don't agree with, and I don't really agree with your advertisers, I'm just going to replace all the ads that you put across the wire towards my customer with my ads that I've sold. Or at least I'll threaten to do so and ask you whether you want to do some revenue sharing of your advertisers. Maybe mandatory revenue sharing. Else, I'll do ad replacement. So, where do we go with that?
Well, I think it's fair to say that that's not a good thing.
Not for you.
That gets into this discussion about how intrusive an incumbent can be in kind of controlling the content that makes up, what Yahoo is or what Google is or what Microsoft is, et cetera. And I think that's a possibility, but I think it's fair to say that that's an unlikely scenario to rear its ugly head. We're dealing with an issue that is mainly focuses around deals around an environment where we're dealing with push. I push traffic out to my user. I'm offering up my my content to my user base. I'm not pushing it up. So it's being pulled by the user. And I don't see in an environment down the road where the incumbent or any other network is able to pick out an ad and place another ad in there. If that were to happen, then I think the whole business model behind what is the internet today would deteriorate, because we provide the services and products that we provide on a daily basis to the users here in the audience through the revenues that we generate from ad revenue. So it may be more likely that an incumbent or a cable provider, et cetera, would likely compete with us rather than just head on, rather than try to pick apart what we are. And that's likely to happen. Who knows? That gets into this discussion about a walled garden and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I think we've got some networks in the audience here that have moved away from a walled garden, and there's some discussion about whether or not this type of environment will create more of a walled garden environment. The net will not be tomorrow what it was yesterday or what it is today. I mean, it's constantly evolving. So where it goes from here, who knows? I mean, the Yahoo position is, one where we are waiting to see how this whole thing shakes out. It certainly makes for great television and, a dramatic discussion. But I know that's a long-winded response to a simple question. Bottom line, I don't envision something like that happening.
All right. Yeah, Sean, go ahead. 1 minute, maybe two.
I want to propose a more realistic example, because unfortunately without substitution you're likely to get caught. AOL could certainly do it because they have proxies and so on and so forth. Everybody else would pretty much do the same thing. Much more insidious would be, hey, my marketing people tell me that Yahoo's contract is coming up for review with their ISP, and we see them as a sales opportunity, although we're kind of the underdog because our prices are high. Never had that happen. So what do we do about it? Well, let's start at our border routers deliberately dropping packets randomly if they are sourced by Yahoo. So the performance towards our customers is not as good as, say, someone else's connectivity to the customers would naturally be. And we can go to Yahoo and we can say, you know, your connectivity to our customers is kind of weak because your ISP sucks. They're not upgrading at the IX, or they're connecting only at internet exchanges which are weak or overloaded or using gigaswitches or whatever. Here's a free connection for you for a month. See if your connectivity improves when using this free connection. Come back in a month. Your connectivity has improved, hasn't it? I mean, our customers love this. Why don't we work out a deal? We'll even give you a discount because you're such an important key account. I've actually seen this sort of thing happen. I've also seen it in such a way that this has been applied towards whole ISPs who are choosing between one major carrier and another major carrier as their primary traffic carrier. We call this salami tactics. You cut off a bit of the network at a time, and most of your customers don't notice. Nobody has visibility into your routers. You can't really prove that it isn't what you're claiming, i.e. that the infrastructure in the network is overloaded. You can do this kind of thing and get away with it because no one has visibility into it.
Yeah. The ad replacement isn't hypothetical either. It just happens in markets that are too small for most of the big content providers to care about. A lot of developing country folks who know that their customers either don't read English or aren't interested in products that aren't going to get shipped to Afghanistan or wherever anyway by, you know, Amazon. Next question. Let's talk about congestion. Is all this just an excuse for backbones to not upgrade, instead to make a lot of noise about how customers need to be rate limited one way or other? How about Gene? Your turn. Other parts of the world, we see people moving from 100 megabits to gigabit on local loop, but we don't see that here. We see a lot of backbones that aren't growing quite as fast.
Well, first off, Woody, my lawyers said that whatever I say here is not that Neustar is not taking an official position on net neutrality at all. Yeah. But to actually go back for a second to the thing that Brokaw was talking about the ads, something that I don't know if you all realize, I don't know how many of you all watch baseball games today. This is really not on the internet, but when you all watch baseball games, that the ads that you see on the boards on the outfield and so on, a lot of times those ads that you see on TV are not the ads that are actually on the boards. They've been digitally replaced by the broadcaster. So that's, in a sense, an analogy of something that's already happening today. Sorry for going back, but
no, absolutely.
I figured I'd just point that out, that the technology exists already and it's already happening in another medium today. But back to your issue about the, is it an excuse? Not being a carrier, but being a former carrier, it's probably debatable that if you're a conspiracy theorist, sure, but me personally, I'm a big believer in capitalism, that if the demand is there and people want to serve their customers, then it's going to happen no matter what. I mean, where I live, something that you alluded to earlier was that in terms of choice of broadband providers, where I live, I have actually 5 broadband providers that I can pick from. And I know that's a little bit unusual, but I think for a lot of the major metropolitan markets in this country, and I think in Europe and Asia as well, you're starting to get more and more providers, and then also this whole municipal Wi-Fi thing that's coming into play. That's kind of probably a dark horse that who knows how that's going to also affect this argument about net neutrality, because if you all of a sudden start having the municipal Wi-Fis that, assuming they provide decent service, how does that affect this argument about the net neutrality?
Well, interestingly, that was the next question. So do we all agree that both network neutrality and local loop unbundling only matter in the absence of competition? If we've got competition, do either of these things matter anymore?
Well, I think competition helps resolve this issue because then, you know, an end user can decide, well, do I want to go with option A, which is going to take a more active role in adjusting the knobs on my user experience versus going with an option B, which is going to stay uninvolved with adjusting, my user experience. So competition generally is a good thing. When you have a monopoly in a market, then you have to deal with all the issues that come along with that. I think in some countries where there is only one choice and you have to deal with that monopoly, you don't always have the benefit of innovation and the drive to innovate and improve your product or service compared to your competitors. So I'm hopeful that we will continue to have more and more competition in that space. One of the things that concerns me, personally a little bit about that in the content space is that if I only have one option to get to a huge user base, and that option is going to be more expensive for me than what I might see as a solution to get to other users, then price elasticity is going to rear its ugly head. I'm going to have to adjust my user experience based on how much it costs to deliver that user experience to that user base. And I don't know if that's a good thing for the internet. And that's kind of one of the topics that we have likely all discussed around net neutrality. One of the things that has driven broadband access and the delivery of high bandwidth video and broadband applications is the fact that that stuff is available. Peer-to-peer traffic has gone up. We're being asked by our users to stream higher and higher bitrate video and content, and we have to incur great expense to do that. And if there's an expense on top of the expense we already see, then we will likely have to throttle back on what we're doing as an organization. And I'm sure other smaller companies that don't have the economies of scale that the likes of Yahoo or Google or other Limelight, et cetera, other companies have, they're going to be in a situation where maybe it's the best they can do to deliver a 28.8 feed of a video rather than a 1 meg feed.
So I think I'm going to try and start wrapping this up here since we're kind of running into lunch. And I'm just going to run down the panel really quickly and try and get a sense. So 3 choices here. Do we have competition right now, sufficient competition? Do we need more regulation? Or do we need more competition? Yeah, Brokaw.
Well, I think we do have choice, although we are seeing a bit of consolidation right now. Underlying carriers behind cable companies look a lot like the providers for, or the incumbent in that market as well. And so there is a bit of consolidation, though I think this is a free market and we'll continue to see motivation in the market to provide competing services. There's a lot of technologies that are just on napkins right now that will likely become realities within the next 5 years. So what were the other questions? That was
so. Do we already have competition?
Yes.
Enough competition?
Well,
or
more is better, but we have competition.
Do we need more competition, or do we need more regulation?
Regulation is a tough one because personally, again, I'm not speaking for Yahoo here. I think we've all, over beers, pontificated the whole idea of, the same people that deliver mail or try to deliver mail, try to, regulate, the internet. But at the same time, I think, the audience and many of my friends and colleagues at access partners or at content providers, are struggling with what the end game here looks like. And so we are, I think, as an organization, as the North American Network Operator Group, I think we all hope that the internet continues to evolve and continues to develop healthily. Whether or not that pans out to be the case is pretty much up to the people either in this room or the people in Washington.
All right. And Sean, is it fair to say that you're for more competition?
Do we have enough competition in the United States? No. Do we have enough regulation in the United States? We have more than enough, but all in the wrong direction. It's telling you what you should do in order to be a carrier rather than allowing carriers to evolve into particular niches in the marketplace. And unfortunately, it seems that this issue has been really seized upon by the Congress, who are making it a big issue, introducing bills all over the place, and it looks like they're going to do for network neutrality and utility what they've done for spam. So really, I'm not hopeful that the regulatory process is going to go anywhere in this country anytime soon without a major change in the philosophy of regulation.
Yeah. Sean Donelan?
So my view is that the regulation tends to freeze things as a status quo. It doesn't actually give you more competition. And if we want more competition, if we don't think we have enough now, we need to work on the regulation that gives us effective competition rather than just different brand names for the same product. So regulation is very good for saying, well, as long as you have 2 different brand names or 4 different brand names all on the same thing, that's not real competition, even though it may look like that. So my view is regulation is useful, but again, it has to go in the right direction. And right now, it seems to be going in the wrong direction. It seems to be going, trying to make everything look alike rather than rewarding things that look different.
Gene?
In terms of the first question about is there enough competition or is more competition needed, it's actually a kind of both. Because like the example I gave you earlier that where I live, I have 5 facilities-based broadband providers, which admittedly is unusual, but then I know there are plenty of other parts of the country and in North America that actually have no broadband providers at all. So I guess the answer there is
20%, in theory, 20% of Americans have no access to broadband.
Yeah, I guess it depends on you break down by demographics or geography or whatever. So I guess the answer there, Woody, is that the answer depends on the situation. And in terms of regulation, I think I'll pass on that one.
Yeah.
Hey, Woody?
Speaking of, yeah, Michael.
Michael Sinatra, UC Berkeley. I have one just quick, and I'm very hungry, so very quick response to the baseball analogy and the ad substitution. In the case of the baseball analogy, the baseball games, the service provider, the TV station, is paying the content provider for the content. And in some cases, they're even negotiating with the content provider in terms of the ads they're going to show. So all of that stuff is done in advance. But the important thing is, you're paying me for the content. I'm Major League Baseball. You're paying me for the content, and you can put ads on that to recoup some of that expense. But the important thing is you're paying for the content. If I'm providing content to you for free, what right do you have to change that content and change the ads that are on it, in a moral perspective? I think that's still an open question.
So what we see is, in that case, one side's paying the content. On the internet, we also see where the user is paying for the content. And for a while, we had the big raise was dial-up accelerators, where a lot of dial-up providers, to increase the speed, would essentially reformat the pictures on the download to make them smaller to go across the dial-up. So the user is paying for that experience. Does the user also have any moral rights to change the content as they receive it? So there's like both sides.
Ted Seeley from Sprint. Bill, very soft pitch. Come on, ask the hard questions. So the incumbent ILECs are going to spend billions and billions and billions to build out local infrastructure to deliver video services, right? But that video delivery service model is going to change immensely in the next 10 years. How do they recover their cost?
By charging their customers enough to pay for the service that
But
their
in a
customers
free
want
market
to buy?
internet, I don't have to pay them for that because I can go get that service wherever I want as the movie distribution channels change over the next few years. Why do I pay SBC/AT&T for it when I can buy it from Sony for half the price? They're just
or buy it
packets.
even less from the Pirate Bay.
Say again, Sean?
Buy it at even less from your favorite torrent search engine.
Well,
Yeah, or,
there's got to be a pipe. You've got to get it there somehow.
but to Sean's point, I start the download this morning when I leave for work, and when I come home, it's done.
Okay, but it crossed somebody's pipe and that person got paid.
But I
Question is
paid
whether
him,
they
I already
billed
paid him, no, I paid him my monthly bill. His entire business model is built on delivering you services, these value-added services, right? He's got to justify the billions he's going to spend ripping his copper out of the ground to put fiber in, right? But I don't have to buy those value-added services in 10 years. Picture it this way.
So is it the government?
It's IMS all over again, except just a different sector of the market.
Is it the government's job to guarantee the success
I think
of a
some people
specific
would,
business
I think
model?
some people would like to see it that way.
Oh, yeah. That's certainly the truth. Okay, so we're now at sort of questions from the audience, obviously, and late for lunch. If there are any more questions, I think, yes, Patrick.
Hello, Patrick Gilmore from Akamai. If the providers want to charge the content, if the telco providers want to charge the content owners for delivering their content, how much are the providers going to charge each other for delivering all the stolen content that they're trading back and forth? I'm just wondering, since that's the overwhelming majority of most people's traffic when they actually give stats.
Yeah, well, I think that was a rhetorical question, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I think we'll turn it back over to Steve for lunch.
All right, thank you, Bill. Thank you, panelists. This was very interesting.